Hi, second graders. Well, we're going to do chapter 3 of Earthquake Terror. Here we go. Jonathan hit the ground hard, jarring every bone in his body. Immediately, the earth below him moved, tossing him into the air again. As he dropped back down, he saw the trunk of a giant redwood tree tremble. The huge tree swayed back and forth for a few moments and then tilted toward Jonathan. Frantically, he crawled to his left, rushing to get out of the tree's path. The roots ripped loose slowly as if not wanting to relinquish their century-long hold on the dirt. As Jonathan scrambled across the unsteady ground, he clenched his teeth, bracing himself for the impact. The tree fell. Air whizzed across Jonathan as the tree trunk dropped past and branches brushed his shoulder, scratching his arms. The redwood tree crashed beside him, missing him by only a few feet. It thudded down, landed at an angle on another fallen tree. Dirt and dry leaves whooshed into the air and then settled slowly back down. The earth shuddered, but Jonathan didn't know if it was from the impact of the tree or another jolt from the earthquake. With his heart in his throat, Jonathan crept away from the redwood tree toward Abby. Beneath him, the ground swelled and retreated like ocean waves. Twice he sprawled face down into the dirt, unable to keep his balance. The second time he lay still, with his eyes closed. How much longer would this go on? Maybe he should just lie there and wait until the earthquake was over. "Mommy!" Abby's shrill cry rose above the thundering noise. Jonathan struggled toward her again, his heart racing. When he finally reached her, he lay beside her and wrapped his arms around her. She clung to him, sobbing. "We'll be okay," he said. "It's only an earthquake." Only an earthquake. He remembered magazine pictures of terrible, devastation from earthquakes. Homes toppled, highways buckled, cars tossed upside down, and people crushed in debris. Only an earthquake. "We have to get under shelter," he said. "Try to crawl with me." Keeping one arm around Abby's waist, he got to his hands and knees and began crawling forward on the undulating ground. "I can't," Abby cried. "I'm scared. The ground is moving." Jonathan tightened his grip, dragging her across the ground. A small tree crashed beside them. Dust rose up, filling their noses. "I want Mommy," Abby shrieked. He pulled her to the trunk of the huge redwood tree that had uprooted. "Get under the tree," he said, as he pushed her into the angle of space that was created because the center of the redwood's trunk rested on the other tree. When Abby was completely under the tree, Jonathan lay on his stomach beside her, with his right arm tucked beneath his stomach and his left arm thrown across Abby. He pulled himself in as close as he could so that both he and Abby were wedged in the space under the big tree. "What's happening?" Abby sobbed. Her fingernails dug into Jonathan's bare arm. "It's an earthquake." "I want to go home." Abby tried to push Jonathan away. "Lie still," Jonathan said. "The tree will protect us." The dry forest floor scratched his cheek as he inhaled the pungent scent of dead leaves. He felt dwarfed by the enormous redwood and tried not to imagine what would have happened if it had landed on top of him. "Moose," he cried. "Come, Moose." Beneath him, the ground trembled again. Jonathan tightened his grip on Abby and pushed his face close to hers. A sharp crack rang out beside them as another tree hit the ground. Jonathan turned his head enough to peer out. He saw the redwood branches quivering from the impact. What if the earthquake caused the redwood to move again? What if it slipped off the tree it rested on and crushed them beneath it? Anxiety tied a tight knot in Jonathan's stomach. The earth shuddered once more. Abby buried her face in Jonathan's shoulder. His shirt grew wet from her tears. The jolt did not seem as severe this time, but Jonathan thought that might be because he was lying down. Moose, panting with fear, huddled beside Jonathan, pawing at Jonathan's shoulder. Relieved that the dog had not been injured, Jonathan put his right arm around Moose and held him close. As suddenly as it had begun, the upheaval stopped. Jonathan was unsure how long it had lasted. 5 minutes? 10? While it was happening, time seemed suspended, and Jonathan had thought the shaking might go on for days. The woods were quiet. He lay motionless, one arm around Abby and the other around Moose, waiting to see if it was really over. The air was completely still. After the roar of the earthquake, the silence seemed both comforting and ominous. Earlier, even though there were no other people in the area, he'd heard the magpies cawing, and a squirrel had complained when Jonathan tossed a rock. Now he heard nothing, no birds, no squirrels, not even wind in the leaves. He wondered if his parents had felt the quake. Sometimes he knew earthquakes were confined to fairly small areas. Once, Grandma Whitney had called them from Iowa. She had seen news reports of a violent California earthquake less than 100 miles from where the Palmers lived. "Are you all right?" Grandma cried when Mrs. Palmer answered the phone. "Was anyone hurt?" Grandma had been astonished when none of the Palmers knew anything about an earthquake. After several minutes of quiet, Jonathan eased out from under the tree. He sat up and looked around. Moose was still trembling, licked his hand. Jonathan put his cheek on the dog's neck and rubbed his ears. He had chosen Moose at the animal shelter more than 6 years ago. The Palmers had planned to get a small dog the moment Jonathan saw the big golden retriever, who was then 1 year old. He knew which dog he wanted. Mrs. Palmer had said, "He's too big to be a house dog." Mr. Palmer said, "I think he's half moose." Jonathan laughed and said, "That's what I'll name him, Moose." His parents tried unsuccessfully to interest Jonathan in one of the other smaller dogs before they gave in and brought Moose home. Despite his size, Moose was a house dog from the start. He slept beside Jonathan's bed every night. They played fetch and their own version of tag, and Jonathan took Moose for long walks in the country park. In the summer, they swam whenever they had a chance. When Abby had her accident and Jonathan's parents focused so much on their attention on her, Moose was Jonathan's comfort and companion. Now, in the devastation of the earthquake, Jonathan found comfort in the dog's presence. He let go of Moose and looked around. "Wow," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "That was some earthquake." "Is it over?" Abby's voice was thin and high. "I think so." He grasped Abby's hand and pulled her out from under the tree. She sat up, apparently uninjured, and began picking leaves out of her hair. "Are you okay?" he asked. "My knee is cut." She touched one knee and her voice rose. "It's bleeding," she said, her lip trembling. "You pushed me under the tree too hard." Jonathan examined her knee. It was a minor cut. He knew that if he made a fuss over it, Abby would cry. He had seen it happen before. If his mother showed concern about a small injury, Abby practically got hysterical. But if Mom acted like it was no big deal, Abby relaxed too. It was as if she didn't know whether she hurt or not until she saw how her parents reacted. "It's all right," he said. "If that tiny little scrape is all you got, you are lucky, and so am I. We could have been killed." "We could?" Abby's eyes grew round. Quickly, Jonathan said, But we weren't, and the earthquake is over now." "Where's my walker?" she asked. "What happened to my walker?" Jonathan stood up. His legs felt wobbly, the way they always did when he got off his skateboard after skating for a long time. "I'll get it," he said, but when he looked around, he did not see Abby's walker. He didn't even see the trail where she had been standing when the walker was jolted out of her hands. Toppled trees crisscrossed the earth like spilled toothpicks. Not all of the trees had fallen, but even those that remained standing had lost limbs. The ground was littered with branches of all kinds. I want my walker. Abby was near tears again, looking frantically in all directions. Where's my walker? It's under one of the fallen trees, he said. I'll find it. Jonathan began to lift the downed branches, looking under them. In some places, branches were layered 3 or 4 deep. Many were too large and heavy to lift. All he could do was dig through the leaves and try to see what was under them. Do you see it? Abby asked. Not yet, but it has to be close by. We were standing right here when the earthquake started. No, we weren't. We were over here. Abby pointed about 20 feet from where Jonathan was searching. He hesitated. She might be right. He couldn't swear which direction they had rolled on the ground or how far he had crawled trying to find protection under the fallen tree. And it was impossible to tell where the trail had been. The woods looked the same in every direction, devastated. He climbed over a pile of branches, making his way toward where Abby pointed. As he continued his search, his mind raced, wondering exactly how much damage the earthquake had done. What about Mom and Dad? Had they made it into town already, or were they still in the car when the earthquake came? What if the road was blocked by downed trees before they got to town? Mom couldn't walk, and Dad couldn't carry her through this kind of mess. What would they do? Do you see it? Abby asked. The earth shuddered again. It's come back, Abby yelled. Moose barked. Jonathan crouched, covering his head. It was a single jolt this time, an aftershock. It lasted only 5 minutes, but that was long enough to send Jonathan's blood racing through his veins. He wondered how many more aftershocks there would be. When it ended, he waited a few seconds, and then, when nothing else happened, he stood and continued his search. He pushed back another pile of branches, bent down, and looked through the tangle of leaves. Here it is, he cried, as he spotted a metal leg sticking out from under a small tree. He lifted the tree and kicked the walker free. It was badly bent, with one leg twisted at a right angle to the others. When she saw the walker, Abby gasped, It's broken. I can't use it that way. Well, maybe I can straighten it. Jonathan stood on the base leg and pulled on the top of the walker with all of his might. Instead of straightening, the metal leg snapped off. Abby looked more frightened now than she had during the earthquake. What will I do? She whimpered. How will I walk? Jonathan knew she was dependent on her walker. When she went to sleep at night, it always stood beside the bed where she could see it as soon as she opened her eyes. When she ate, her walker waited beside the table, where she could reach it. He felt a rush of empathy, thinking what it would be like to be unable to swing your legs out of bed in the morning and walk unaided to the closet for your clothes. In the same instant, he realized how frustrating it must be to inch slowly along the trail to the lake while your big brother jogs impatiently ahead. I want Mommy, Abby wailed, tears spilling onto her cheeks. So do I, thought Jonathan. Another aftershock began, stronger this time. Jonathan felt as if he were standing on a great accordion, whose sides were moving in and out. He dropped to the ground and covered his head until the moment stopped.